The next member of the herpes virus family is CMV, which stands for cytomegalovirus. The syllables of megalo remind us of the megalo prices you find at a supermarket, which is why it's the setting for our next video. So let's talk about some general characteristics of the virus. Remind me, what type of genetic material is found in CMV? Good, DNA, which you can tell by the blue tones of the store. And since host cell DNA is found inside the nucleus, DNA viruses replicate inside the nucleuses too. Now remember that CMV is part of the herpes virus family, so we'll draw this Hermes messenger on the back shelf here. The herpes viruses all share something in common, and CMV is no exception. This commonality is represented by the sleeping man over here. That's right, they remain latent in cells. Specifically, CMV is latent in mononuclear cells, which, if you break it down, just means white blood cells with one nucleus, which includes cells like lymphocytes, monocytes, and macrophages. Our symbols for these lymphocytes are archers and knights for B and T cells, respectively. Notice we also have a castle down here with some bars that look like cages to represent macrophages. So again, CMV can be latent in B and T cell lymphocytes and macrophages, all of which are known as mononuclear leukocytes. The virus can be reactivated when a person becomes immunosuppressed, represented by this old woman waking this man up with her cane. The cane, of course, represents immunosuppression, and she's using it to wake up the latent sleeping man. We'll go into more about immunosuppression later. CMV can be transmitted in a number of different ways, including blood, sexual contact, breast milk, saliva, and urine. So if you can think of it, it can be transmitted in it. But also notice what we're drawing here. Yep, these are torches. So what do you think this stands for? That's right, it's a torch infection. So I'm going to run through those again because too much practice can't hurt. That's toxoplasmosis, rubella, CMV, HIV, herpes, syphilis, and also VZV and parvo. So let's talk about congenital CMV. It's actually the most common fetal viral infection. So first, let's take a look at this little guy here, who had accidentally driven into this blueberry muffin display. Why blueberry muffins? Well, the rash associated with CMV is often described as a blueberry muffin rash. This is because it can cause thrombocytopenia, which presents clinically with a petechial rash. This is the same rash seen in congenital rubella. Additionally, CMV can also cause hepatosplenomegaly and jaundice, which we'll represent with this spotted yellow cow over the dairy section. Finally, the boy's covering his ears to represent sensorineural hearing loss. Congenital CMV also causes structural abnormalities in the brain, including intracranial calcifications and ventriculomegaly. These calcifications can occur around the ventricles, thus periventricular calcifications, or they can occur in the parenchyma itself. We'll first depict ventriculomegaly with these large helmet vents on the side of the child's helmet that are meant to look like large ventricles. The milk has splashed from the display onto the helmet, and notice it's spilled specifically around the ventricles, hence periventricular calcifications. Milk has calcium in it, so we thought this was fitting. There's another congenital infection associated with intracranial calcifications, and if you're going in order, you haven't encountered it yet, so I'll just give you a heads up. It's toxoplasmosis. Overall, these changes in brain structure can lead to mental retardation or seizures, which we'll represent with this man here slipping on the milk. Notice as he's slipping, that motion artifact makes it look like he's seizing. The milk or intracranial calcifications were what caused him to slip. So let's review the CMV torch infection. First, we have the blueberry muffin rash. Second, we have jaundice and hepatosplenomegaly. Third is sensorineural hearing loss. Fourth is ventriculomegaly. 5, intraventricular calcifications. 6, seizures secondary to those neuro findings. Pretty devastating disease, isn't it? Now, I have some trivia questions for you. Is congenital CMV more likely to be symptomatic or asymptomatic? The answer is actually asymptomatic. Around 80 to 90% of newborns who get congenital CMV are asymptomatic. In other words, they're off the hook. and that's why we have this sign here that says 80 to 90% off. That only leaves 10 to 20% who actually develop symptoms. Also, 15% of these children later develop progressive hearing loss, mostly unilateral, but sometimes bilateral. That's why it's important to screen children for hearing deficits not only at birth, but as they get older too. If a pregnant woman is infected with CMV, which trimester is associated with the highest risk of congenital CMV? That's the second trimester. There's yet another presentation of CMV transmitted in utero, and that's hydrops fetalis. Hydrops fetalis is basically heart failure leading to severe edema with fluid accumulation in multiple compartments. It most often leads to spontaneous abortion. So here's our symbol for hydrops fetalis. It's this balloon animal which shows the swelling and edema and is surrounded by water representing hydrops. So this may not be the most PC way to represent this sad outcome, but I guess it is just a memory device. Anyway, let's finish up this section of CMV with two more fun facts. First, it's the #1 cause of mental retardation from a congenital viral infection, which should be easy to remember considering it's the most common fetal viral infection in general, and it can cause mental retardation. Also, it's the #1 cause of sensorineural hearing loss. So to represent both of these #1s, we'll draw this #1 on the kid's shirt here. Again, he represents mental retardation and sensorineural hearing loss. Now, let's move on to cover some other manifestations of CMV. I mentioned earlier that it's associated with immunosuppression, and this can include transplant patients on immunosuppressants as well as patients with HIV/AIDS. So let's first talk about transplant patients. What in a grocery store reminds you of organ transplants? Another slightly macabre image, but it's the butcher, who has a variety of meats and various organs on ice to represent organ transplantation. Transplant patients are at risk for developing CMV pneumonia. So let's add a butcher here, coughing, with stains on his aprons in the shape of lungs to represent CMV pneumonia. To detect CMV in transplant patients, you can perform a Buffy coat culture. The Buffy coat is part of the blood that contains white blood cells and platelets, and you can incubate these cells with fluorescent anti-CMV antibodies and detect the presence of the virus. Alright, let's shift focus to another group of immunosuppressed patients, AIDS patients. We'll represent the CMV infections that can be present in AIDS patients around this cashier here, who's an old man with a cane. AIDS patients are particularly at risk for CMV infections, especially when their CD4 counts drop below 50. To help you remember this, we've drawn a donation sign that says Charity Drive for CD, and it's 50 cents for a red HIV/AIDS ribbon. So you would look for CMV infections in AIDS patients with CD4 counts less than 50. The most common manifestation in AIDS patients is CMV retinitis. It causes full-thickness retinal necrosis and is sometimes described as a pizza pie retinopathy. So we're drawing in this pizza pie here that looks very similar to what you would see with your ophthalmoscope. Symptoms include blind spots, flashing lights, or even vision loss. Typically it occurs unilaterally, but without treatment, the other eye can be involved. CMV esophagitis and colitis are other things to watch out for in these patients. Let's make the conveyor belt here look like an esophagus with some linear looking ulcerations. It's important to be able to distinguish CMV esophagitis from herpes esophagitis, and the descriptive difference between the two is that CMV is usually singular, deep, and linear, whereas herpes is usually multiple and shallow. So if you think about a conveyor belt and picture getting a rock or a piece of glass stuck in the crack at the end of it, it would create this long, deep, singular, linear ulceration as the conveyor belt keeps moving forward. Then at the other end of the counter, we'll have these grocery bags that put together look kind of like colonic hostra to remind you of CMV colitis. The red dots with tears are meant to look like ulcerations in the colonic walls. An interesting thing about CMV is that when it infects cells, you'll find owl's eye inclusions. And this is definitely another buzzword, though it's not necessarily specific for CMV, but it could help you narrow down the choices. This will be represented by this character on Owl-O cereal boxes in this man's basket here. Now there's a product I'd buy.
Although cereal is a trademark of Sketchy Group Incorporated, cannot be reproduced, transmitted, distributed, sold, or broadcasted without prior written consent from Sketchy Group Incorporated.
Okay, so let's talk treatment. There are two main drugs you should associate with treating CMV. The first is ganciclovir. A recurring symbol for any of the cyclovirs has been this recycling bin. So to remind you that it's specifically ganciclovir, we're making it green for G, and we're writing cans only, since gan rhymes with can. The second line treatment is foscarnet, which is represented by this fast car with a net. Foscarnet, pretty close. Well, this is used when the virus has the UL97 gene mutation, which makes it resistant to ganciclovir. That's why the car has this UL97 sticker on its side. Lastly, people who are not immunosuppressed can also become infected with CMV, and the most common presentation in that case would be CMV mononucleosis. It'll have the same symptoms as EBV mononucleosis. So if you've already watched that video, then you should know that these symptoms are sore throat, lymphadenopathy, and fatigue. So take a look at this child's mom. She's screaming at the poor kid, and you can see the back of her throat is red, which is meant to look like it's inflamed, for sore throat. So since it looks so much like mono, what's a quick way to tell a difference? Well, if we ran a monospot test on a pharyngeal swab, it would be negative. So to remind you of this test, we have the mom carrying a no-mo-spot detergent for negative monospot. Overall, CMV is quite an interesting virus. From deafness to esophagitis to pneumonia, it can manifest itself in so many different ways. Well, after all that review, you may be a bit hungry. So make your way to your local Megalo market and pick up some Sketchy Micro Al-O cereals. Now 80% teratogen free, coming to a store near you.